Just to make the point even more clearly, Texas is a republic by accident. Texans didn't want to be a republic. They just got rejected by the US. So the other thing, and I said this before, Texas was stronger. The Texas Republic was much stronger in memory than it was in reality. And Torget talks a lot about this. The Texas Republic is broke. It cost a lot of money to fight the Texas Revolution, and that money had to be paid back. A lot of it was New Orleans money. And the Texas government didn't really have much ability to tax. And so the Texas government under Sam Houston, it barely functioned. Again, it's under attack from Comanches and other Indian groups in the north. Mexico is constantly threatening to march back into Texas and recapture it for the Mexican nation. Um, uh, the city of Houston becomes the first capital of the Republic of Texas. It was started by the Allen brothers. And the reason that Houston is where it is, it's the most inland part of Texas that you can ship goods to the Gulf of Mexico. So Houston, if you know Houston, what are we, about 40 miles from Galveston, 50 miles from Galveston, but Buffalo Bayou allowed goods to be shipped to the Gulf of Mexico. And why did the Allen brothers, why did they want Houston to be in the interior? To offer some protection from hurricanes. So Houston is established somewhat inland from the Gulf of Mexico, but still via Buffalo Bayou, which is now the ship channel. It still has access. It can send goods to the Gulf of Mexico, but it's a failure as a city. It's dangerous. It's no one wanted to be here. It's a complete mess of a capital. It's really kind of pathetic. Now, on the other hand, you do have cotton production starting to take off. And what's significant is that Texas cotton, the Republic of Texas cotton, is a player on the world stage. And there's a section in the Torget chapter, the first chapter that you read for this week, on this group, McKinney-Williams, and you don't have to get into the nuts and bolts of what those folks were. They were cotton brokers. They were folks that wanted to get cotton to these markets in England and the Northeast. And what they did, this is very significant, is that they enticed British shippers into investing in a voyage to Texas. So a British merchant ship came to Texas hoping to pick up cotton, which you could then take back to England. And that's exactly what happened. The Ambassador was a British ship. It picked up about 1,200 bales of cotton in Galveston. And when it sailed in 1839, it was a big moment for the U.S., for the Texas cotton industry, not the U.S., the Texas cotton industry, because it showed that Texas could become part of the international trade with cotton. And that's the real key of the McKinney-Williams story and the story of the British ship, the Ambassador. It showed that Texas could become a player on the world stage, that it could get its cotton to Europe, where there was tremendous demand for cotton and cotton was drawing very high prices. So that's very good. But on the other hand, in the late 1830s, the price of cotton drops by half. There was overproduction of cotton. There's a depression in the United States, and the depression in the United States very much affects Texas because Texas is oriented to the U.S. economy. Basically, New Orleans is the banker of Texas. You could argue in some ways that New Orleans economically is the most important Texas city because that's where folks look to go get loans and to send their cotton in many cases. So there's a depression, and so the price of cotton collapses. It dropped almost overnight. It drops by half. which really causes problems for Texas because I said in an earlier podcast, the economy of Texas depended on the high price of cotton. And suddenly when it drops in half, that's not a good thing for Texas. And again, we can relate to this if just thinking about the price of oil and how gas has gone up and down over the last couple of years. Okay, so Texas has proven two things. It can prove it can be a global player, that it can sell cotton to New York City, New Orleans, but also England, Manchester, Liverpool, that kind of a thing. But at the same time, the price of cotton collapses. And suddenly Texans, many of them had taken big loans to build their farms and plantations, and this money has to be paid back. So the Texas economy comes to a kind of a screeching halt. And it had started out very promising, but very quickly it kind of dries off the cliff when the price of cotton collapses. And again, commodity prices, they rise and they fall, and they rise and they fall. They're not steady. So at this point, England starts to play a big role in the Republic of Texas in a way that I think is often forgotten in Texas history. So why is England interested in Texas? It's not very hard to figure out. Cotton. England sees that Texas has the potential for being one of the biggest cotton growing areas in all of North America. Not only is Texas big, it's got really great soil for cotton. It's largely undeveloped. And so Great Britain is very much keeping an eye on Texas. And it's kind of like Texas is Kuwait or Saudi Arabia or Qatar. It's like Great Britain saw the potential for cotton growth in Texas in the same way in the 20th century. You have the U.S. and Great Britain moving into the Middle East because there's this sense that there's a lot of oil in the Middle East. Well, Great Britain senses that Texas can be a real center of cotton production, the Republic of Texas. And Great Britain wants to take advantage of this because it needs cotton. So very much Texas is on the radar screen of Great Britain. So what happens is that Texans feel like they develop what Tourget calls cotton diplomacy. They think that the fact that they can grow so much cotton and that they can grow more cotton, it's going to force the U.S. to recognize them or to annex them, which doesn't happen. But when it comes to Great Britain, Texas feels the same way. The Texans feel like Great Britain has such a need for cotton that the British government will recognize Texas as an independent nation because Great Britain and the merchants of Great Britain are so desperate for cotton. Now, what happened is this idea of cotton diplomacy was really exaggerated. It wasn't as powerful a weapon as the Texans thought. It didn't give them as much leverage either in Washington or London as they had thought. And so initially, London is very, very reluctant to recognize Texas. Texans send over a diplomat right after the Texas Revolution, but the British government is very, very reluctant to recognize Texas as an independent nation because the abolitionist feeling in Great Britain is growing stronger and stronger and stronger. So Great Britain is willing to buy cotton from Texas, but initially Great Britain is not willing to recognize Texas as an independent nation. And the other thing is Great Britain really doesn't want any headaches with Mexico either. But that's a factor. But the bigger factor is this rising tide of abolitionism in Great Britain, anti-slavery feeling in Great Britain, that the British government didn't feel like it could go against it because Britain was a democracy. It was a limited democracy, but it was still a democracy. And the British government couldn't go against the very powerful current of abolition. So what happens is the British are continually trying to find a way to exploit Texas, but without slavery. And here's what they hit upon. In the early 1840s, they approached the Texans and they say, look, we will offer you a treaty. We will a commercial treaty. We'll buy your cotton. We'll offer you another treaty where we mediate with Mexico and try to persuade Mexico to recognize Texas as an independent nation. So Great Britain was going to throw its weight behind trying to persuade Mexico City to recognize Texas as an independent nation. But this was the kicker. Texas had to stop the international slave trade. And this is what I was talking about in a previous podcast. Remember, slaves from Africa are still coming into Texas via Havana. What would happen is captives would be kidnapped. They would be put on the horrible ships for the nightmarish Middle Passage. Havana was a center for slavery and the selling of African slaves in the Western Hemisphere. And remember, the United States had abolished the African slave trade in 1808, okay? So for the most part, slaves from Africa are not coming into the United States after 1808. But Texas had never been part of the United States, right? So the 1808 abolition of the international slave trade, the African slave trade, didn't apply to Texas. So what the British told the Texans is that, okay, we'll inch towards recognition, commercial treaty, mediating with Mexico, but you have to promise us that you will stop importing slaves directly from Africa via Havana. And as Torget spells out, the diplomat that agreed to the treaty in London, he tried to hide that part of, there were 3 treaties. He tried to hide the treaty in which Texas agreed to stop the slave trade from Africa, but the British wouldn't have any of it. They were too smart, they're too sophisticated, and they forced Texas basically to agree to stop the importation of captives directly from Africa. So Great Britain flexed its muscles, and Texas did sign an agreement that stopped the importation of slaves from Africa. So slaves were coming directly from Africa to Texas. That was the only what's now U.S. state that was receiving captives from Africa, but of course it wasn't a state at this point. So you can see the power of Great Britain in Texas. It forces Texas to stop the importation of slave captives from Africa. And what the British are really trying to do is they're trying to abolish slavery in Texas. And they're just doing it one step at a time. The first thing they do is they abolish the slave trade from Africa. But long term, here was their game plan. They wanted Texas slavery to die out. They wanted free workers producing cotton in Texas. So what Great Britain is trying to do, it's trying to maneuver the Republic of Texas into abolishing slavery, and that slaves would be paid some kind of a wage. I mean, their conditions still would be horrible. It certainly would not be a utopia for the slaves, but at least there would not be slavery, legal slavery, chattel slavery, slavery for life. So this is the game the British are playing. They're trying to position Texas as a free soil, i.e. free labor, i.e. free labor means workers that are getting paid a wage. The British are trying to end slavery in Texas. They're playing a long game. And the first step in trying to end slavery in Texas is abolishing the African slave trade, that Texas will no longer accept slave captives from Africa. So as you can imagine, this is going to freak out American Southern slaveholders, because they are really desperate to have Texas come into the Union as a slave state. So Great Britain plays a very, very significant role in the history of the Texas Republic. And again, if the British had had their way, they would have ended slavery in Texas. But things went differently.